Until the summer of 1938, there was no wage in America too low to be legal, no floor, no minimum. No law anywhere in the federal statute books that said a human being's labor must be worth at least something. An employer could pay a grown man $1 a day, or 50 cents, or a quarter, and the only limit was what desperation would accept. A garment contractor could pay a woman by the finished piece, dock her for thread, for needles, for the electricity that ran her machine, for talking, for lateness measured in minutes, and hand her at week's end an envelope containing $3 for 60 hours of work. All of it legal. A mill could employ a 10-year-old through the night shift. A mining company could pay its men not in dollars at all, but in scrip, private currency, spendable only at the company's own store, at the company's own prices. Legal, legal, legal. And when reformers tried to change this, when states passed the first modest laws, saying that at least women and children must be paid enough to live on, the Supreme Court of the United States struck the laws down. Not once, repeatedly, across 2 decades, in the name of a constitutional principle you have probably never been taught, called liberty of contract, the doctrine that the freedom of a starving seamstress to accept $3 a week was a sacred right the government could not touch. The court did not merely permit the bottomless wage. It constitutionalized it. Then, in the space of 15 months, between the spring of 1937 and the summer of 1938, the entire structure fell. A chambermaid from a small town in Washington state, fired from a hotel and owed back pay, took her case to that same Supreme Court and won, in a reversal so abrupt and so politically charged that it entered legal folklore with its own nickname. A president at the height of his power forced through Congress, over the bitterest resistance of his own party's southern wing, a law that had been unthinkable for half a century. And on June 25, 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was signed. For the first time in American history, there was a number 25 cents an hour, below which a covered worker's time could not legally be bought, 25 cents. It sounds like a punchline. It was a revolution. And like every revolution in this series, it left fingerprints, compromises, and casualties that still shape the country. Whole categories of workers deliberately written out of the law, deals whose motives were recorded frankly at the time and politely forgotten since. A wage floor that has been fought over, raised, frozen, and eroded ever since. And an economic argument, does the floor save the poor or price them out? That has run for 100 years without a final verdict. It is running still in this year's legislatures in almost exactly its original words. So this story asks the questions the textbooks skip. What did American workers actually earn? In the long era when the answer was anything at all. How did families survive on wages that the era's own investigators proved were below survival? Who decided that a wage could be a moral question and not just a price? And why did it take a factory fire, 3 constitutional wars, and the worst depression in history to write that answer into law? And the strangest question of all, why did the country that invented the modern economy come so late, later than Australia, later than Britain, to the idea that work should keep a worker alive? The answers begin in a world whose economic morality was built on a single iron sentence. A wage is a price, and prices have no conscience. To feel what the world before the wage floor was like, do not start with theory. Start with an envelope. It is Saturday night in a tenement district. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, pick your city. Somewhere around 1905, and the week's pay is being counted on a kitchen table. If the man of the house is a common laborer, and common labor was the largest single occupation of the age, the envelope holds perhaps $1.50 for each 10-hour day he worked when there was work. $9, $10 for the week, minus the days the yard was slack, minus the layoff weeks that came every winter and every panic. If he is a steel worker, the envelope may be fatter. And it was earned in 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, an industry that worked its men on a schedule scholars of the period describe without exaggeration as the harshest in the industrial world, capped by the infamous long turn, the 24-hour continuous shift that came around every other week when the day and night crews traded places. If the envelope belongs to a woman, a garment worker, a laundress, a department store clerk, it holds, as a matter of standard practice, roughly half what a man's would hold. $5, $6, $7 a week was the ordinary range documented over and over by state investigators, and out of it came rent, food, clothing, and car fare in that order, with the order breaking down at the end of most months. Now set the envelope against the era's own arithmetic of survival, because the progressive age, whatever else it lacked, did not lack honest accountants. In 1904, the social investigator Robert Hunter published a landmark study that put a number on the line below, which life in the industrial North could not decently be sustained. Roughly $600 a year for a family. Budget studies by state bureaus, settlement houses, and economists refined the figures city by city. And then the same investigators counted what the envelopes actually held, and found that enormous shares of American working families, by careful contemporary estimates a third or more of the industrial population, lived below the line. Not the idle, not the unlucky few. Working families, headed by employed men, arriving every year by wage arithmetic alone, at a destination the era learned to call poverty in the midst of plenty. The gap between the envelope and the line was closed the only ways it could be. By the wages of children, by taking in boarders until beds were slept in shifts, by the pawn shop cycle we met in an earlier story, and by the quiet subtraction of things, meat, doctors, heat, shoes, that budget investigators recorded in ledgers whose dryness does not survive close reading. The children deserve their own paragraph, because they were not a margin of this system. They were a load-bearing wall. The census of 1900 counted on the order of 1.75 million children between 10 and 15 years old at work in America, and the count was widely understood to run low, missing the youngest and the hidden. They were in the cotton mills of the Carolinas, where mill villages recruited whole families and small hands doffed bobbins through 12-hour shifts. In the coal country, where breaker boys hunched over chutes, picking slate from coal until their fingers bled, an air that blackened their lungs before their voices broke. In the glass houses, night shifts preferred. In the canneries, the tenement homework trades, the newsboy armies of every city. Their wages, a quarter a day, 50 cents, a few dollars a week, were not pocket money. They were structural. Family budgets across industrial America balanced only because childhood had a price. When the photographer Lewis Hine traveled the country for the National Child Labor Committee, talking his way into mills and mines with invented pretexts and an honest lens, the faces he brought back, tiny spinners at towering frames, breaker boys, ancient at 11, did as much as any statistic to make the era's arithmetic unbearable to look at. Yet a federal child labor law was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1918, and a second in 1922, and a constitutional amendment stalled in the states. So the children stayed in the frame until the very law this story is about finally wrote the general ban that stuck, and at the system's edges stood arrangements that dispense with the pretense of the free wage altogether. In the company towns of coal and timber and textiles, the employer was also the landlord, the storekeeper, the doctor, the church builder, and sometimes the law. Pay came partly or wholly in scrip, the company's private money, negotiable at the company store, where prices ran famously above the town down the road, when there was a town down the road. Debt to the store rode from month to month, binding the worker as surely as the sharecropper's lien we met in the credit story. The model town of Pullman, Illinois, built as a showcase of enlightened paternalism, revealed the arrangement's iron logic in the Depression of 1894, when the company cut wages by a quarter and more while holding rents firm, deducting the rent, as ever, from the shrunken pay, and lit one of the epochal strikes of American history. In the South, the convict lease system rented prisoners, overwhelmingly black men, swept up under vagrancy codes whose enforcement rose and fell with the labor market, to mines and plantations at rates that made free labor look expensive in prisoners' lives by the mortality records that survive, cheap beyond stating. These were the floor beneath the floorless wage, standing reminders at the edge of every negotiation of what the alternative to accepting the envelope could look like. Here is the part modern viewers find hardest to absorb. Virtually none of this scandalized respectable opinion, because respectable opinion had a theory, and the theory was airtight. Wages taught the era's orthodoxy were prices set by supply and demand like the price of wheat. Interference could only misfire, pay a worker more than his product was worth, and he would simply not be hired. The kindness would starve its object. Behind the economics stood a harder Victorian metal, the conviction that wages measured worth, that the sober and industrious rose, and that the state had no more business setting a floor under a man's pay than under his character. Behind both stood the Constitution, as the courts of the era read it. The 14th Amendment's liberty construed to include liberty of contract, the employers' and the workers' twin freedom to strike any bargain they chose, a doctrine given its classic form in 1905 in Lochner against New York, when the Supreme Court struck down a state law limiting bakers to a 10-hour day as unconstitutional meddling in the bargain between master and man. The dissent in that case by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes became one of the most celebrated in the court's history, a protest, in substance, that the Constitution had not enacted anyone's economics textbook. But dissents are consolation prizes. For 30 years, Lochner's doctrine was the wall, and every wage law in America would be built or broken against it. What finally cracked the wall was not an argument. It was a fire, and a young woman standing on a Greenwich Village sidewalk, watching it, whose name would be on the wage law's birth certificate 27 years later. The fire, when it came, would strike a workforce that had already tried to warn the city. And the warning is a story in itself. In November 1909, the young women of New York's shirtwaist shops, immigrant Jewish and Italian workers, most in their teens and 20s, had filled Cooper Union's Hall to debate a general strike over wages, hours, and conditions. The cautious speeches of the male labor leadership droned until a slight garment worker in her early 20s named Clara Lemlich, already beaten on picket lines that season, demanded the floor and in Yiddish called for the general strike now. The hall rose and took the old oath with her. What followed entered labor history as the uprising of the 20,000. The largest strike by women America had yet seen, wastemakers picketing through the winter, arrested by the hundreds, clubbed by hired thugs while society matrons, the Mink Brigade, the papers called them, posted bail and marched alongside in one of the era's strangest alliances. The strike won gains across much of the industry. Among the shops that resisted the union to the end, Holding out against the strikers' demands, which included attention to the very conditions of exit and safety later seared into testimony, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. 16 months later, the fire found it. History rarely stages its ironies so plainly or so cruelly. The warning had come from the workers themselves, in the streets, in winter, 16 months early, and the answer had been bail hearings. On the afternoon of Saturday, March 25, 1911, Frances Perkins, 30 years old, a social worker and investigator newly arrived in the world of New York reform, was taking tea near Washington Square when the noise began. She ran with the crowd and stood on the sidewalk as the top floors of the Ash Building burned. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company, a garment factory employing mostly young immigrant women, some in their early teens. The fire had found a workroom packed with cotton scrap and hanging patterns. The workers had found, in their moment of need, a ninth-floor exit door that, by the testimony that followed, was kept locked during working hours, a fire escape that peeled from the wall and dropped its climbers, elevator shafts that became chimneys, and firemen's ladders that reached only the 6th floor of a 10-story building. And so, before the eyes of the gathering city, the women of the Triangle Company came to the windows and jumped. Alone, in pairs holding hands, dozens of them, their fall witnessed by a crowd that included, at its edge, the future first woman in an American cabinet. 146 workers died in under 20 minutes, most of them women, many of them teenagers. The owners were tried for manslaughter and acquitted. A civil settlement some years later valued the dead, in the arithmetic of the day, at $75 a life. Perkins would say, decades later, and in substance, that the New Deal began that afternoon, and whatever allowance one makes for retrospect, the documentable chain is real. Because the fire did what fires do in this series. It converted arithmetic into politics. New York convened a factory investigating commission with young legislators named Al Smith and Robert Wagner at its head and Perkins among its investigators. Over 4 years, it walked lawmakers physically through the mills and sweatshops. Perkins made sure the politicians saw the rooms, the exits, the children, and it rewrote the state's labor code so thoroughly that New York became the reform movement's national laboratory. And the movement's wage wing now moved to its main event. If hours could be regulated for safety, could pay be regulated for survival? Massachusetts answered first, in 1912, with the nation's inaugural minimum wage law, cautious to the point of timidity, covering only women and children, setting wages board by board and enforcing compliance chiefly by publishing the names of refusing employers, on the theory that shame was constitutional even if compulsion might not be. Over the following decade, roughly 15 states, mostly Western and progressive, went further with genuinely binding minimum wage laws for women, Oregon and its neighbors in the lead, all built on the same constitutional gamble, that the court which had blessed regulating women's hours, the 1908 case of Muller against Oregon, argued by a Boston attorney named Louis Brandeis, with a brief famously stuffed with social facts rather than precedents, would extend the same protective logic from hours to wages. The Americans, it must be said, were arriving late to a feast others had set. New Zealand had legislated wage arbitration in 1894. The Australian state of Victoria created wage boards for the sweated trades in 1896. And in 1907, an Australian judgment gave the movement its scripture when Justice Henry Bourne Higgins, ruling in the Harvester case, held that a fair and reasonable wage must be reckoned not from the employer's profits, but from the needs of a human being living in a civilized community, the living wage defined from the bench as the normal standard of a new nation. Britain followed in 1909 with the Trade Boards Act, establishing minimum wage machinery for the sweated trades, and the bill's great parliamentary champion supplies this story's most delicious cameo. The young president of the Board of Trade, one Winston Churchill, who argued in substance that where the bargaining power of the parties is grossly unequal, the good employer is undercut by the bad and the bad by the worst, and that a floor was the remedy for precisely that degeneration. The future icon of conservatism, pioneering the minimum wage, file it among history's reminders that our present arguments wear their party costumes loosely. The intellectual wind blew from America's own pulpits too. The papal encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891 had declared against the pure market the worker's right to a wage sufficient for frugal comfort, and in 1906 the Catholic priest and economist Father John Ryan built the doctrine into an American treatise, A Living Wage, that armed a generation of reformers with a moral vocabulary the economics textbooks did not stock. When American states began their experiments in 1912, in other words, they were not innovating, they were importing, and the imports had papers. One resistance, though, will surprise you more than any of the era's alignments. Organized labor itself was ambivalent, and at the top, hostile. Samuel Gompers, the founding chief of the American Federation of Labor, opposed legal minimum wages for men on grounds he repeated for decades in substance. What the state gives, the state can take. A legal minimum would become the practical maximum. And a working class that looked to legislatures rather than to its own organization would remain a client, not a power. The union's craft elite, bargaining above any conceivable floor, saw little for themselves in it. The reformers' laws were accordingly built for those the unions had not organized. Women, the young, the sweated trades, which is a large part of why the entire first generation of American wage laws wore the protective, women-only form the courts would judge. The minimum wage at its American birth was not labor's demand. It was the reformers' answer to labor's absence, and the two wings of the movement would not fully close ranks until the Depression taught the unions what a bottomless market does to bargains struck above it. Meet, before the gamble is judged, the movement's engine, because she is one of the fiercest and least remembered figures in American reform. Florence Kelley, daughter of a protectionist congressman, translator of European socialists in her youth, Illinois' first chief factory inspector, and for 3 decades the general secretary of the National Consumers League, ran the campaign for the minimum wage the way a great general runs a long war. State by state, brief by brief, boycott by boycott. Her league mobilized the buying power of middle-class women, the white label, certifying goods made under decent conditions, and her office, more than any other single room in America, coordinated the alliance of investigators, lawyers, and women's organizations that drafted, defended, and staffed the state laws. It was Kelley's league that recruited Brandeis for Mueller. Kelley who pushed the wage laws west. Kelley of whom a later justice would say, in substance, that she had a genius for making the comfortable see. Keep her in the frame as the constitutional verdicts come in, because the verdicts were aimed in every practical sense at her life's work. The gamble rode for a decade, and then, in 1923, the wall answered. In Adkins against Children's Hospital, the Supreme Court confronted the District of Columbia's minimum wage law for women and struck it down, 5 votes to 3, in an opinion that reads today like the era arguing with its own future. The women's vote had just been won, reasoned the majority. Women were now civic equals, and equality meant equal exposure. Their liberty of contract could no more be protected by a wage floor than a man's. A minimum wage, the court added in its most quoted stroke, was a naked transfer. It compelled the employer to pay, in effect, an arbitrary sum unconnected to the bargain to solve a social problem that belonged, if anywhere, to society at large. The dissenters answered in kind. What earthly logic, one asked in substance, made a law fixing maximum hours constitutional and a law fixing minimum pay not? And Holmes, dissenting once more, was blunter still. But the arithmetic was 5 to 3. Adkins did not merely void one statute, it beheaded the movement. State laws fell or fell dormant. Enforcement gave way to voluntary boards issuing suggestions, and for 14 years, through the boom, through the crash, into the abyss, the constitutional law of the United States held, as a settled proposition, that a wage floor for a grown woman violated her freedom. Then the Depression arrived to conduct its examination of the theory. Between 1929 and 1933, with a quarter of the workforce unemployed and the rest bidding against them, wages did what unfloored wages do in a bottomless market. They fell through every level the progressive investigators had ever charted. The sweatshop, pronounced dead by 2 decades of factory laws, returned in forced garment contractors in Pennsylvania, and Connecticut advertising girls' wages of $1 or $2 a week, grown men in sawmills at 5 cents an hour. The era's investigative files, state and federal, filling once more with the arithmetic of 1905, now with photographs. The spectacle broke something in the old orthodoxy, and not only among radicals, employers themselves the better ones, pleaded publicly that they could not hold decent wages against competitors cutting to the bone, that the race to the bottom was a race no one could refuse and no one could win, and that only a floor under everyone could stop it. The argument that would carry the Fair Labor Standards Act was forged in those years, and its author was not compassion. It was ruinous competition, the discovery, made in the pit, that a wage with no floor eventually becomes every employer's problem. Roosevelt's first answer, in 1933, was the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Blue Eagle. Industry codes, negotiated sector by sector, fixing minimum wages and maximum hours across the economy, displayed in shop windows under the Eagle's wing with the slogan of a national mobilization. The Blue Eagle season deserves its snapshot because for 2 strange years the wage floor lived as pageant. The Eagle itself, a stylized thunderbird clutching a gear and lightning bolts over the legend of doing our part, went up in shop windows, on delivery trucks, and newspaper mastheads and film title cards. Consumers were exhorted to buy only where it flew, boycott by patriotism replacing the Consumers League's old white label at national scale. 250,000 marchers paraded down Fifth Avenue under it in the greatest procession the city had seen. Beneath the pageant, the codes did real work at the bottom. The Cotton Textile Code, first approved precisely because the mills were the wage seller of industrial America, set minimum weekly wages and banned child labor in the industry where the breaker boy generation's fight had begun, and mill wages jumped. Beneath the real work churned the chaos. Hundreds of codes drafted trade by trade, price fixing tangled with wage fixing, small businessmen railing at rules written by their larger competitors, and a tailor jailed. The case became national folklore for pressing a suit below the code price. For 2 years, America effectively had its first general minimum wages, and then in 1935, the Supreme Court struck the whole apparatus down, unanimously, in the case of a Brooklyn kosher poultry firm, the sick chicken case, the wits instantly christened it, holding that Congress had delegated its lawmaking power wholesale to the code writers and reached, through a local chicken slaughterhouse, commerce that was not interstate at all. Even the court's liberals signed on. The NRA's collapse was mourned surprisingly little, its chaos having exhausted most of its friends. The wage floor's first federal incarnation died at the age of 2. The court followed in 1936 by voiding New York's minimum wage law for women, reaffirming Adkins into the teeth of the Depression, a decision so raw, coming as sweatshop revelations filled the papers, that condemnation poured in from both parties. Even the Republican presidential candidate that year found it indefensible. The stage was now set exactly as the dramatist would have it. A president re-elected in the greatest landslide yet recorded, a court that had struck down the centerpiece of his program and the state's programs besides, and a proposal, announced in February 1937, to break the deadlock by enlarging the court itself. The court-packing plan convulsed the political system through the spring, and in the middle of the convulsion, the court turned on the case of a chambermaid. Elsie Parrish had cleaned rooms at the Cascadian Hotel in Wenatchee, Washington, Apple Country, for wages below the level set by the state's minimum wage law for women, a law of 1913 vintage that Adkins had left standing but sleeping. Discharged, she did a small, enormous thing. She sued for the difference, a few $100s, and her case climbed, chambermaid against the constitutional order, to the Supreme Court of the United States. On March 29, 1937, weeks into the court-packing storm, the court ruled 5-4 in West Coast Hotel against Parrish. The Washington law was constitutional. Adkins was overruled. Liberty of contract, wrote Chief Justice Hughes for the majority, was not absolute, and a legislature could rationally conclude that workers without bargaining power were exploited by starvation wages, and that the community, which ended up subsidizing such wages through relief, had a stake in the bargain after all. The fifth vote belonged to Justice Owen Roberts, who had voted with the Adkins side only months earlier. His reversal, forever nicknamed the switch in time that saved 9, remains one of the most argued-over votes in court history. Capitulation to the packing threat, said the wits. An independent change already made before the plan was announced, insist the defenders of the record, with documentary support. What is beyond argument is the consequence. The wall of 1905 fell in an afternoon. The wage floor was at last constitutional. The chambermaid collected her back pay. The court-packing plan itself died in the Senate months later, defeated in part because the court's turn had drained its urgency. Roosevelt lost the battle and won the war. And among the spoils of that war was the bill his labor secretary had been carrying, in draft after draft, for years. For the labor secretary was Frances Perkins, the woman from the sidewalk, and she deserves, at this hinge, the portrait the textbooks shrink to a caption. Boston-born, Mount Holyoke educated, apprenticed in the settlement houses, and hardened in the factory commission's stairwells, she had learned to move through rooms full of hostile men by a strategy she described frankly in later life. She dressed and carried herself, quite deliberately, to remind them of their mothers. She took a merciless press. Cartoonists and columnists found the first Madam Secretary an inexhaustible target. A faction of Congress attempted in the late 30s to impeach her over an immigration case and failed, and she outlasted 12 years of it, the longest tenure any labor secretary has ever served, while carrying private burdens, including a husband institutionalized for much of their marriage, that she permitted almost no one to see. Washington's wits called her the woman who read the riot act to the president. The truer record is the one in the documents. Nearly every plank of the modern American labor floor, the pension, the insurance, the wage, the hour, the childhood, passed across her desk on its way into law. When Roosevelt had asked her in 1933 to join the cabinet, she had accepted by her own account on conditions. She handed him her list. Unemployment relief, public works, the abolition of child labor, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and a floor under wages with a ceiling over hours, and told him she would take the post only to pursue it. Social Security, whose story this series has told, checked off the middle of the list in 1935. The Fair Labor Standards Act was the last item, and it nearly did not survive its own passage. The fight over the Fair Labor Standards Act, from the spring of 1937 to the summer of 1938, was one of the most bitter legislative wars of the New Deal, and the enemy was not the Republican opposition. It was the Democratic Party's own Southern wing, and the record of why deserves to be told with the frankness the participants themselves used, because this is the part of the minimum wage's birth that the commemorations skip. The South of 1937 was the nation's low-wage region by design and by defense. Its industrial recruitment pitch to Northern capital was explicitly cheaper labor, and its labor was priced on a dual scale: white wages low, black wages lower, the differential enforced by custom, exclusion, and terror where required. A single national wage floor threatened the whole architecture, and Southern congressmen said so on the record with a candor that modern readers find startling. A federal minimum, warned one senator from Georgia in substance, would compel the employer to pay the black worker and the white worker alike, and that not the cents per hour was the intolerable thing. Others dressed the objection in regional economics, demanding a Southern differential, a lower legal floor for their states, and the differential fight nearly killed the bill twice. The measure passed the Senate, then stalled in the House, Bottled up by the Southern Controlled Rules Committee through the winter of 1937-38, pried loose only by discharge petition, and the pivotal shove came from an unexpected quarter. In May 1938, Senator Claude Pepper of Florida, campaigning openly for the wage bill, crushed an anti-bill opponent in his primary, a Southern electorate voting, visibly, for the floor, and within days the House petition filled, the bill moved, and in June it passed. Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act on June 25, 1938, remarking around that season, in substance, that no business dependent on paying less than living wages had any claim to continue in this country, and that fair labor standards ranked, next to Social Security, among the most important acts of his presidency. What the act delivered was, on its face, modest to the point of anticlimax. 25 cents an hour, rising by steps to 40. A work week capped first at 44 hours, descending to 40, with time and a half beyond, the invention, as a universal standard, of overtime and of the American weekend's legal skeleton. And at last, the general prohibition of oppressive child labor that 4 decades of campaigning had failed to secure. Perhaps a fifth of the workforce was covered at the start, and the $quarter floor bit, by the estimates of the day, on some hundreds of thousands of workers immediately, concentrated exactly where the opponent said it would bite. Southern mills, first of all. Picture the quarter landing, because in the mill towns it landed like weather. The Labor Department's new wage and hour division, the enforcement arm the act created, and the ancestor of the inspectors who police paychecks to this day, opened for business amid a blizzard of correspondence from workers who had heard, many for the first time in their lives, that the government of the United States had an opinion about their envelope. The division's first administrator described the mail arriving by the van load. In the southern mills and lumber camps at the bottom of the scale, the first-year raises reached hundreds of thousands directly. Paychecks in covered cotton goods jumped measurably within months, and the act's other blade cut just as concretely. The 40-hour standard with premium pay did not merely shorten labor. It invented, as a legal artifact, the American weekend, converting the 2-day rest from a union prize and a white-collar custom into the default architecture of national time. Every Saturday errand and Sunday game since runs on the 1938 clock. Few statutes have rearranged both the pay envelope and the calendar. This one did it in the same paragraph, at the age of 25 cents, but the act's deepest legacy lay in what and whom it left out, because the price of Southern passage was paid in exclusions, and the exclusions had faces. Agricultural laborers excluded, domestic workers, the maids, cooks, and laundresses of households excluded. In the South of 1938, those two categories embraced the substantial majority of black workers. A fact the era's own officials and scholars stated plainly then, and historians have documented exhaustively since. The same carve-outs for the same coalition arithmetic had shaped Social Security 3 years earlier. The first federal wage floor in American history was thus laid deliberately around the occupations where the poorest workers stood, and the perimeter held for a generation. Coverage reached farm and service workers substantially only in the 1960s and after, domestic workers' full inclusion later still, and the research on the 1966 expansion, which swept hotel, restaurant, farm, and service workers under the floor, credits it with a measurable share of the era's narrowing of the black-white earnings gap. Laws this series keeps finding are maps of the coalitions that passed them. The FLZA's original map, with its carefully drawn blank spaces, is among the most honest documents American politics ever produced about itself, and one more absence from the act deserves its footnote, for it governs arguments still. The floor was written as a number, not a formula. No indexation. The minimum wage rises only when Congress affirmatively votes, which means that in every year Congress does not act, inflation quietly lowers it. The floor is, by design, always sinking unless lifted. Hold that thought for the epilogue, because the entire modern politics of the minimum wage lives inside that single drafting choice. What happened after 1938 is really 3 stories braided together. A story of expansion, a story of erosion, and a story of argument, and each deserves its honest telling. The expansion came in waves. Amendments in 1949, 1961, and 1966 raised the number, and more consequentially widened the map. Retail and construction, then schools, hospitals, farms, restaurants, hotels. Decade by decade, the blank spaces of 1938 were inked in, until coverage that began at perhaps a fifth of workers approached the great majority. The floor's real purchasing power climbed with the post-war boom and crested in 1968, when the minimum of $1.60 an hour reached its historical peak in real terms. A moment worth marking because it has never been reached since. And the floor did measurable work along the way. The studies of the 1966-67 expansion find sharp wage gains precisely in the newly covered industries, borne disproportionately by black workers in the South. The exclusions of 1938 partially repaid, 30 years late with interest still owing. The erosion is the quieter story, told entirely by that missing formula. After 1968, and decisively after the 1970s inflation, the raises came slower than the prices. The federal floor's real value has trended downward across half a century, punctuated by legislative jumps that recover part of the lost ground and never all of it. The federal minimum has stood at $7.25 since 2009, as this is recorded, the longest span without an increase in the law's entire history, while its real value has sunk below the levels of the 1950s. Two consequences followed, each reshaping the landscape. First, the states and cities moved. A majority of states now set floors above the federal number, some at double it or more, and the country has quietly reverted to something like the pre-1938 map, a patchwork of local wage regimes, except with the federal floor as a fallback rather than a void. The Fight for 15 campaign of the 2010s, launched by fast food walkouts and dismissed at birth as fantasy, having succeeded in an arc that Florence Kelley would have recognized. City by city, state by state, until the fantasy was the law of most of urban America. Second, in the law's basement, a relic, the tipped minimum wage, the separate, lower cash floor for workers earning gratuities, frozen by a 1996 deal at $2.13 an hour, where it remains federally to this day. A number so archaic it functions as a museum exhibit of the whole pre-floor world, preserved behind glass in every restaurant paycheck in the states that still use it. The tipped wages basement deserves one flight more of stairs, because the practice it preserves has its own charged history. Tipping arrived in America from aristocratic Europe after the Civil War and was, for decades, denounced here as un-American. A bribe culture importing servility into a republic. Several states banned it outright in the 1910s before the bans collapsed, rooted deepest where employers discovered its darkest convenience. Industries that hired the newly emancipated, the Pullman Company, greatest employer of black men in America, built its celebrated service on porters paid trivial base wages and instructed, in effect, to earn their living from the passengers' pockets, a wage structure that shifted the payroll to the customer and the bargaining to a smile. When the FLSA era finally reached tipped work, the compromise embedded the old structure rather than ending it. The tip credit, letting employers count gratuities toward the minimum, which is how a nation with a wage floor came to retain, in law, a class of workers whose income the customer, not the employer, is expected to complete. The 213 basement is not an oversight. It is the 19th century, paying its respects, one last legal seal closed the era this story opened. In 1941, in United States against Darby, a Georgia lumber case, the Supreme Court upheld the Fair Labor Standards Act unanimously, burying its own 1918 child labor precedent with something close to apology and declaring Congress's power over wages and hours in interstate production beyond further debate. The wall of 1905 was not merely breached now, it was carted away. No serious constitutional challenge to the wage floor's existence has stood since. A finality worth pausing on. In a series full of arguments that never end, the courtroom argument did end. Only the economic and moral ones remained, which is to say, the human ones. The argument, the 100-year argument, deserves this series even-handed close, because it is genuinely unresolved and genuinely serious on both sides. The classical case has never changed, and has never been trivial. A floor above a worker's productivity prices that work her out of work entirely. The minimum wage, its critics from the era's economists to the present insist, helps those who keep their jobs at the expense of those never hired. The least skilled, the youngest, the most marginal, and the kindest-looking law can function as a ladder with the bottom rungs sawn off. The reform case answers on two fronts. Morally, that a wage is not wheat, that the labor market's weaker side bargains under duress the commodity model ignores, and empirically, that the predicted job losses, when researchers finally measured them with modern methods, kept failing to appear at the predicted scale. The critics' side owns this story's most vivid exhibit, and fairness requires displaying it. The FLSA's uniform quarter applied in 1938 Puerto Rico, where prevailing wages in the island's great needlework industry, embroidering for the mainland from homes and workshops, ran at a small fraction of the new floor. The result was swift and grim. Orders fled, shops closed, and the island's employment crisis worsened until Congress retreated the following year, creating special industry committees to set lower island rates. Opponents of the minimum wage have cited Puerto Rico for 80 years as the doctrine's cleanest demonstration, the floor set far above the market, doing exactly what the theory warns. Defenders answer that it demonstrates only the uncontested corner of the theory, the danger of a floor wildly out of scale with local wages, and says nothing about moderate floors in strong economies. Both readings are serious. The episode's real lesson may be the one both sides can sign. The minimum wage is not one policy but a dial, and everything depends on where. Relative to the wages around it, the dial is set. The academic argument acquired its modern form in 1946, when the economist George Stigler published the classic case that the minimum wage was poorly aimed at poverty and priced out the marginal, the paper that armed a generation of skeptics. The turning point of the modern debate came in the 1990s, when two economists, David Card and Alan Kruger, studied fast food employment across the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border as New Jersey raised its wage, and found no detectable job loss, a result that detonated a methodological revolution, dozens of border studies, and 3 decades of dueling literatures. The present state of the science, stated with the honesty both camps deserve. Moderate minimum wage increases appear, in the weight of recent evidence, to raise earnings with small or undetectable employment effects. Where the floor might be pushed high relative to local wages, the old warnings retain force, and serious economists differ in published work in real time about where that line lies. Card's Nobel citation, decades later, honored the work's method. The argument it started shows no sign of concluding. It is, after all, the same argument the sidewalk generation had with the orthodoxy of 1905, conducted now with better data and the same stakes. So step back one last time and look at what this story actually chronicles, because beneath the statutes and the cents per hour, it is the story of a single sentence being overturned. The old world sentence was, "A wage is a price." Everything in the world before 1938 flows from it. The $3 envelope, the breaker boys, the scrip, the court's majestic defense of the seamstress's liberty to starve by contract. Everything in the long revolution flows from the counter sentence the reformers spent 50 years writing into law. A wage is a relationship between unequal parties, conducted under necessity, with the community holding a stake in its outcome, because the community pays, one way or another, for every bargain struck below the cost of a human life. Neither sentence is innocent of consequences. The centuries' argument between them has been conducted on both sides by serious people looking at real casualties. But notice which sentence the world actually chose. Nearly every nation on earth now has its floor. The American floor, born last among the industrial democracies, pioneered the model much of the hemisphere copied, and no political movement of consequence anywhere proposes returning to the bottomless wage. The argument that remains, how high, how local, how indexed, is an argument inside the reformer's sentence. The orthodoxy of 1905 did not lose a debate. It lost the world, and yet the story refuses the comfortable ending, on two counts that honest history must file. The floor was built with blank spaces drawn around the poorest, and some of the spaces, the tipped wage, the surviving farm exemptions, the gig work frontier where the oldest question who is an employee has been reopened by app are still blank or newly blanked. Every generation, it turns out, redraws the perimeter, and every perimeter has a politics. The floor, unindexed, sinks by default, which means the minimum wage is not a settled achievement, but a perpetual vote, an institution that exists only as long as someone keeps lifting it, like a note that sounds only while the key is held. Frances Perkins, who watched the women fall in 1911 and signed the law's birth certificate in 1938, understood this better than her monuments do. The list she handed Roosevelt was not a list of laws. It was a list of promises, and promises, unlike prices, are kept only on purpose, one Congress, one State House, one envelope at a time. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten systems, people, and decisions that shape the modern world, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.